So continuing the program, our next speaker is Professor Jeff Peppercorn from Mass General in Boston. And Jeff is going to be talking about developing on the promise of advancing science in oncology with particular focus on the policy implications in global context. Jeff.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. It was a privilege to participate in this commission. Next slide. So I thought I'd ground this discussion in some real cases from the past 2 weeks. This was this Monday morning, 61-year-old woman with early-stage breast cancer. Her cancer was found on mammogram. She underwent a lumpectomy. She had a 2.5 centimeter cancer, but fortunately it was lymph node negative, low grade, grade 1, estrogen receptor positive. She has an excellent prognosis. Unfortunately, I don't have the clicker because a lot of animation in these slides. But with surgery and radiation alone, her risk of recurrence would be about 20%. And we've already had the advance of having a daily aromatase inhibitor pill that can cut her risk to below 10%. So I thought this was a good news case. I didn't go over this with her, but it happens that this pill, it's about, a month's supply is at most $15 out of pocket. It's generic. So great. This is a problem we have a solution to. And I presented this to her as good news, and then she looked at me very worried and said, well, can I start it next week after I get my next check? And next slide. It brought home the fact that even for when we've made the discoveries, and even for seemingly low-cost therapy, access is not guaranteed, and that's something we have to pay attention to. So next case. So again, here, next one, a 38-year-old. Sorry, wish I had a controller here for this. Annoy you guys. A 38-year-old woman with early-stage breast cancer, but this time she's got a 4-centimeter cancer. It's lymph node positive. It's grade 3 and estrogen receptor positive, but also HER2 positive. So this is an aggressive subtype of breast cancer. She has a very poor prognosis without adequate therapy. Now, we've made serial advances in therapy over the years, so you can see there that as of 2000, we had dose-dense chemotherapy, which would have a cure rate of roughly 65%, cost about $25,000. And then getting to be almost 15 years ago, it's 2005, we've had the addition of trastuzumab could boost the cure rate up to 85% or better with a significant marginal cost, but a big improvement. Then FDA approved pertuzumab based on pathologic complete response, a surrogate endpoint. It's not actually yet 100% clear how much of an improvement in cure that is, but I and others are commonly adding this to the mix for a marginal cost of $20,000. And now, just a few weeks ago, we had a drug neratinib approved. And you take 6 pills, and it boosts your cure rate to something north of 90% for a patient like this who's estrogen receptor positive, about a 4% benefit in that group. But the marginal cost is about $130,000. And so now the total cost, going from 65% to better than 90%, is $225,000 per patient. So it begs the question, is 4% lower risk of recurrence and death meaningful when you're age 38? I would argue it absolutely is, both to my patients and to me. But then, should I, as the medical oncologist, consider costs? How and when should I consider them? Should I discuss the costs with her? Is it worth $130,000 for that 4% benefit? That's a whole different question. Who will pay? Who should pay? So, next slide, thank you. So the question, the issue is that advances in cancer care are important, but they're simply not enough. We need to think about access to quality care for those in need. We need to think about reduction in financial toxicity, elimination of health disparities, as you've been hearing about, and the sustainability of our healthcare system. Next. So in terms of our healthcare system overall, we know that healthcare in the US consumes a large and growing percentage of our gross domestic product, estimated to be about 18%. And health is a good thing to spend money on, but this means we have less money to spend on infrastructure and other social platforms, and on cancer research, as a matter of fact. And about 5% historically of total healthcare expenses have been for cancer care, but just as healthcare costs overall are growing, the percentage that's comprised of cancer care is growing, and all aspects of cancer care deserve scrutiny here, and all aspects contribute to this, but drug costs in particular have been driving a lot of the recent increase. And we've had advances. We've had a lot of advances in cancer care, and this whole point of this commission is that we're hoping to see more over the next 10, 20 years, but the costs have been going up even faster than the advances, which was that slide shows there. The cost per life year gained continues to go up over time. So this is a problem at the societal level. Next. And it's related to societal costs, but it's also distinct from it, the financial burdens that face our patients. We've coined this term financial toxicity to argue that it's analogous to the medical toxicity you have when you take a new drug are the burdens you face. And people like Scott Ramsey have pointed out that the bankruptcy rate among people with cancer is more than 2.5 times greater than similar people, similar age and health status, compared to other people who don't have cancer. But I want to point out that financial toxicity, while important, is really an artifact of our healthcare system. It's not inherent in the drugs and medications we use. It's what we're doing, whether it's on the drug development side or the insurance side. So that's an important consideration. And if we're going to talk about costs, as I think a growing percentage of the population, both doctors and patients, now agree, this has been a real paradigm shift, we have to think critically about what is the content of those discussions, what are the goals of those discussions, and then we need to evaluate the impact, both on access and even on disparities. Are they going to improve disparities, or are they going to exacerbate disparities? Next. And this is just to say, this is not the future that any of us envision or want. It's a cartoon from the New Yorker saying, try to focus less on a cure and more on a treatment you can afford. Obviously, that's not where we want to go. So, thank you. So with this in mind, and recognizing the importance of advances in healthcare policy and healthcare delivery to complement the advances that we're seeing and we're hoping to continue to see in the science, we defined several priorities as part of the Commission report. One of them was to better define value in cancer care. And certainly, I've been part of the efforts within ASCO, and ESMO has taken this on, NCCN, ICER, many other frameworks have been proposed. They all vary somewhat in definition, focus, and their intended use, and I think we're in the early days of this still. So we feel that there needs to be greater effort to really define, such that all stakeholders are involved and invested in this, what is high-value care? The easy things to identify are things that lead to cure or improve survival, but what are the full metrics of that? And then similar in how, when we have high-value care, how do we incentivize greater use of that and access for all? And then when there's low-value care, things that have either marginal or really no clinical benefit, or they're very expensive and there's a good alternative that could be used to do the same thing, how do we reduce or eliminate those practices? That's one of the focuses of future research. Next. And we need more randomized trials to do this, but also we need population-based studies that include cost-effectiveness data. We need to focus on clinically meaningful outcomes, not just a statistically superior endpoint. And we need to, as you've heard already, we need to invest in the infrastructure to bring all of this data together. Next. Related is the priority to understand how best to deliver high-quality and affordable health care. We need innovation in healthcare delivery, things like telehealth interventions when appropriate, evaluation of payment reform programs, many of which pilot studies are ongoing. We'd like to see value-based reimbursement, but you have to define value first. To do value-based reimbursement, that's a challenge. And value from whose eyes. Interventions to reduce patient financial burdens, of course. Yes, more cross-transparency, but as I said, evaluating the impact of cost discussions on both access and disparities, and then understanding the impact of whatever continues to evolve in the health insurance reform arena on cancer care, as well as other aspects of care. Next. Another priority, as you've heard, is to understand and eliminate health disparities. We want to identify existing disparities, not just the common ones we think of with socioeconomic, race, ethnicity disparities, but also gender, age, rural disparities. You heard about some others earlier from Dr. Lippman. We want to understand the interaction between race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and health behaviors that may impact cancer diagnosis and prognosis and treatment. We want to understand the impact of access to care and late diagnosis. And then we want to see interventions looking at reducing and eliminating disparities, things like targeted screening for early detection and navigation programs that help ensure that people get timely access to therapy. Next. We also highlighted the need to improve regulation of cancer research. Now, regulation is critically important to improve the rigor of scientific research, and it protects our research participants, but any regulation in this area as in others contributes to the costs and somewhat to the time from discovery to the clinic. So we need to reevaluate and continually evaluate regulation of both clinical trials, biobanks, our translational research, and even our minimal risk research to improve the efficiency of this and be sure that the regulations are serving the interests that they're intended to. We are calling for the evaluation of institutional scientific review boards and institutional IRBs to improve the effectiveness, efficiency, and to reduce redundancy in the review process. And we're looking to evaluate and understand the impact of the FDA's accelerated approval programs and their breakthrough therapy designation programs. And lastly, and you heard about this already, we're looking at this in a global context. So it's projected that over the next 20 years, we're going to see a more than 50%, unless we can change these trend lines, we're going to see more than 50% increase in cancers worldwide, moving from already 14 million new cases every year today to 21 million. These are often in younger patients. They're treatable, but not yet preventable in many cases. And we're projected to see 60% increase in worldwide cancer deaths, moving from 8 million each year to 13 million by 2030. And WHO has pointed out that 70% of cancer deaths are going to be occurring in low and middle income countries. So certainly there's important work to do in this country, but cancer is a global problem, and international collaboration is absolutely critical to solving this, to doing the most we can with our interventions and our resources. So I'll just conclude by saying that as we make advances in cancer care, one of the priorities has to be making sure that all patients who may benefit, both in the US and abroad, have access to high quality care. We need to better understand and address costs of cancer care and disparities, some of which come from costs. And I'll end by noting that this is I'm a clinician, this is a very exciting time in cancer care and certainly in cancer research, as you've been hearing about, but we need to make sure that the whole oncology community comes together to accelerate our efforts at cancer control and to improve the lives of our patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And our final speaker today is Cliff Hudis, who is a breast cancer specialist from Royal Sloan Kettering, but these days better known as the CEO of ASCO. And Cliff is going to give us a call for action to wrap everything up.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to join everybody here on the panel and to play a very small part in this very big project, for which I'm really grateful to the Lancet for helping to organize. My job is to fundamentally just describe what we do next and where we can make meaningful progress. To do that, I'm going to cover again a little bit of the introduction, talk about how we got here, and the reason is that we can't talk about each one of the individual projects that we would set forward, but rather illustrate how we can collaborate to make some of this needed progress. Next slide. Just a quick timeline. It's November of 2015, right after the Bidens lost their son, and the vice president has decided that he has seen, I didn't forward that, has seen that, I thought it was magic, has seen that there is a desperate need in the U.S. To coordinate the already present resources. The challenge wasn't necessarily to build more and do more. It was to accomplish more with what we already had in hand, but were inefficiently, inadequately using. Next slide. So by the winter, at the State of the Union, the President Barack Obama at that time turned to the Vice President and with these words announced a focus at the level of the White House on establishing or really reestablishing or reasserting America's longstanding commitment, both in terms of finances and other resources, to making progress against cancer. Next slide. And so April of 2016, which is just a few months later, the Blue Ribbon Panel, which you've heard about already, was named. Next. And then these are the various members of the panel, and you've heard from several of them already today, led by Liz and Chi, but with many other luminaries participating very actively. Next slide. And then their report came out just 6 months later. I mean, this is fast work for a community that normally has to spend 8 months just to find a morning to get together. Next slide. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but you could boil the Blue Ribbon Panel's recommendations down to 10 recommendations for focus and 3 specific demonstration projects. I'm not going to drill into those just yet. You can read about them if you want. But that was the highest level output from the Blue Ribbon Panel. Next slide. And then in December, the last bill that was signed by the outgoing administration in a very well-attended ceremony over at the White House was the so-called 21st Century Cures Bill, which included a $1.8 billion supplement for medical research in general, and specifically $300 million in the continuing resolution for 2017. It also renamed the effort specifically and officially the Beau Biden Moonshot in memory of the Biden's son who had died of a brain tumor. Next slide. And these are the members of the Blue Ribbon panel, many of whom, again, are here with us today. Next slide. I'm sorry, back up. I got ahead of myself. These are the members of the commission paper that we're reporting on today. Next slide. And this is the cover, obviously, of the paper, which has come out, I guess, late yesterday. Next slide. So the fundamental challenge that we are supposed to answer is the one issued initially by the vice president. How do we make 10 years of progress in 5 years? That is not, it's audacious and ambitious, but it's not beyond reach. It requires using the tools and the resources that we have already in our environment more efficiently. And there are some specific ways that they call that out. And I say that because this is not a call to cure cancer in 5 years or eliminate all suffering from cancer. It makes no unrealistic aspiration. It is a very realistic one, and it's dependent largely on just doing our jobs a little bit better. Next slide. So these are the challenges that the Blue Ribbon panel really had to confront, which was that on the plus side, there is widespread and unprecedented optimism. I'm quoting from the charge to the panel, and this is what you've heard already from several of the speakers today. There is real palpable excitement in our community in terms of the technology that we now can access and also the ways that we can use it. At the same time, there are a number of challenges, some of them structural and not so scientific. Many entities are engaged with the best of motives in cancer care and research, but often their missions and the authority they have to achieve their aims vary. The government, of course, represents tremendous support and resources, but also sometimes unfortunate challenges in terms of bureaucracy. And funding and resources are always important, even if they're not always the only challenge. So the goal of this effort was to create a new cancer ecosystem that was more fully integrated, that accelerates our advances both in terms of treatment but also care, and is built on a stronger underpinning of scientific understanding. Those are the goals. Next slide. So the Cancer Moonshot Task Force consulted with a large number of external experts and created the Blue Ribbon panel that you've heard about, and their goal was to fundamentally advise the NCAB, and again, you've heard a little bit about this today, and help set priorities and a path forward. Next slide. Again, you've seen this once already. These are the 10 recommendations and the 3 projects that were immortalized in the Blue Ribbon panel report to the Vice President. Next slide. And that brings us to today, the commission. Why is there a commission, and what is it that we hope to achieve? Well, our goal was to extend their work, building on it. This is obviously the opposite of competition. We examined the Blue Ribbon panel recommendations. We spend a little time and dive deeper into the detail, expanding their discussion to include specific areas that I'll get to in a moment. Help set a prioritization schema both for research in the U.S. and maybe around the world, and help support collaborations. And let me pause here to say the entire Moonshot effort is actually built on goodwill and extra governmental work, meaning, yes, there are resources here. Yes, there is an expectation of some of those hundreds of millions of dollars flowing into specific projects. You've heard from Doug Lowy. There are panels that are reviewing proposals and so forth. But the real success of the Moonshot from the first day, as described by the Vice President, has been that our community, with and without specific government resources, would get together and do our work more efficiently. And there are any number of parallel efforts to make sure that happens. And I will show you 1 or 2 from our perspective at ASCO in a few moments, just to illustrate the idea. Next slide. So these are the areas where the commission expanded the discussion. A greater focus on surgical and radiation oncology as disciplines, a greater focus on imaging, a focus on health systems and health disparities. You've heard a little bit about this already this morning. Attention to regulation and financing, both of research and of drug delivery, population science, and so-called onco-policy, which is an international challenge, really. Next slide. There were 22 panels that were charged to do this, and what they did is they broke the subject matter down into discrete areas, reviewed the state of the art, and for each area set priorities. They then went one step further, and if any of you have engaged in institutional strategic planning, this starts to echo, resonate for you. They established measurable objectives and goals and timelines so that they could be, we could be assessed as we move forward. And you can't make progress if you don't establish metrics, and I'm going to show you a few of those in a moment. Next slide. So these were the 13 specific focus areas. There were a few other additional panels that looked at overarching themes, and I'll show you that as well. But you can see that this echoes and extends the initial work of the Blue Ribbon panel. You've heard from Scott specifically about precision cancer prevention. There's a focus on early detection and public health, drug discovery, and I won't read through all of these for you. This is just pulled out of a table in the commission report, but it shows you the way in which the subject matter was divided. Next slide. So just as an example of the way they converted their work into something meaningful, these are two of the panels, and I picked them out because of the way they are overarching. Panel 18 identified 5 key strategic goals from the Moonshot Task Force, and they were shown here: catalyzing new scientific breakthroughs, unleashing the power of data. You've heard about big data projects already. Accelerating new therapies delivery to patients, strengthening prevention and diagnosis, a long-standing aim of our whole field, and always improving access to care. And if you look at the right, panel 21, which focused on disparities and system reform, as well as regulation and onco-policy, you see they tackled some challenging issues. What defines high versus low value care? How do we deliver affordable care in multiple healthcare systems? How do we reduce, if not eliminate, cancer disparities? And what can we do to speed treatment development? You'll notice I didn't limit this to drug. How do we accelerate treatment development so that the cost is lower, and then the lower cost presumably gets passed through the entire ecosystem? Next slide. So here's an example, and with 21 panels with metrics and output, I'm not going to show you them all, but I will show you 2. So these are the measures that were identified for precision cancer prevention. The pre-malignant cancer atlas that you've seen already today, the development of prevention immunotherapeutics prevention. And that goes beyond straightforward infectious disease vaccination, presumably, to even more profound uses of the immune system, and so forth. And then you'll see there are metrics, and these you can hold up a scorecard over the next few years. Within 2 to 4 years, 10,000 patient specimens to do prevention development, cancer epitope vaccines developed in the next basically 6 years, and so on down the line. So they were, I think, realistic and ambitious in setting targets for our community to reach. Next slide. Here you see an example at the other end of the spectrum, from prevention all the way on the health disparities and access to care side. And the goals are very specific: improve cost-effectiveness recommendations and get them accepted in practice, reduce unnecessary medical care, essentially, shorten time to treat. That's obviously a surrogate for access to care. And here you see the metrics: improve novel therapy access in community, rural, and underserved areas. And they want to see this, we want to see this in 2 to 4 years. Decrease cancer mortality. You can measure that in specific disadvantaged communities. And improvements in the peer review process. So these are all, again, I think, realistic, but they will take work and they will take coordinated effort on the part of all of the stakeholders in our community to make this and deliver this progress. Next slide. So a couple of points. All of the people have asked, well, how do we know if the Moonshot effort in general is working? How will we know whether we're making progress? I will give you a short-term win that I think really harkens back to the first utterances on this from the Vice President. Coming out of the end of the last administration, we achieved a reversal in the funding provided to the NIH. There had been many, many years of flat funding, a net loss of purchasing power because, of course, inflation, which doesn't quite keep up with medical inflation. So the overall purchasing power at the NIH had fallen roughly a quarter over a decade. So about 2 years ago, there was a $2 billion bump in the NIH funding. I'm rounding off, and we've seen now at least 2 years of steady bipartisan support for this. And nothing makes me happier than going to the Hill and seeing Republicans and Democrats climbing over each other to take credit for this. I don't care. This is what we needed. We used to have bipartisan neglect of the budget, and now we have bipartisan ownership of it. Great, wonderful. For many years, we were banging on doors trying to explain why this was important, feeling week by week, month by month frustrated. That changed, and I think part of the reason it changed was the bipartisan recognition of all the good that comes from investment in science, technology, healthcare, and specifically medicine, and very specifically cancer care. But what I'm showing you here is just from last week, a public opinion poll that we put out from ASCO with the Harris polling people. And the interesting take-home point in all of this is if you go back and look at the polling, and unfortunately, I think it may have fallen off this. Next slide. Let me see if I have that here. Yeah, this is what I wanted you to see, is that the take-home from this regarding support for cancer research was really astounding. So I'll be precise. 3/4 of Americans would accept, even welcome, higher taxes and or a greater deficit if that meant there was more funding at the federal level for cancer research, period. That's a talking point. In an election, that's a landslide. So I would credit the initial efforts of the vice president and the entire moonshot with coalescing public opinion behind the simple idea that America should be investing more in research and that it's worth sacrifice to make progress in cancer. That's a talking point for all of us, I think, to share. Next slide. Now, on a more practical level, again, I mentioned this at the beginning, the real success of the Blue Ribbon Panel, the NCI's efforts, and then this commission, all of it taken together representing the moonshot, is how it galvanizes the entire community. So at ASCO, somewhat predating this, but not by much, and certainly accelerated because of this, we took on one set of these problems that you've seen described here. Access to cutting-edge therapy, distribution of research into the community, cost savings, and a few other check boxes that we could probably hit. And Rich Shilsky, our chief medical officer, designed and launched within 9 months a novel clinical research trial called TAPER, which is Targeted Agent and Profiling Utilization Registry. I want to describe the problem to you for just a moment. Drugs are expensive. Historically, cancer doctors were expected to give drugs off-label. The label does not regulate or describe or prescribe the practice of medicine. In fact, the label provides entry into the market for a drug, and we are trusted to use these drugs wisely. And in fact, over the history of oncology, medical oncology, most drugs were used most of the time off-label. That's normal. The only thing that changed is they got very expensive. And now, payers enforce the label. And I'll be very precise, if not provocative. That's an unintended use of the label. That's really not what it's meant to do. And we may have to modernize how we label drugs at the FDA just because of that. But make no mistake about it, the label was not meant to narrowly constrain the practice of medicine. But now it does. So all of our patients are getting next-generation sequencing, not all, many. And oncologists all over the country and increasingly around the world are sitting in clinic looking at a list of identified alterations. They're getting suggestions for a drug that in theory should work because of that target, but they can't actually give it off-label the way they did for 30 years before with all other drugs because of the cost. So TAPER is essentially a collection of dozens of phase 2 studies. The sequencing is done routinely in clinical practice. Whether it should or shouldn't be done is obviously an open and evolving question, but that doesn't matter for us. It's done. The patient is sitting in the doctor's office, and the doc can't give the drug that the sequencing suggests, and there's no trial. The drug's FDA approved already. It's in the market, just not for this purpose narrowly. So TAPER matches them by histology, genomic alteration, and then drug. And either in 12 patients identifies no activity despite everybody's best hopes and ends that experiment, or identifies a glimmer of activity and extends it. So this is the kind of collaboration with industry, academia, and insurers and others that I think is what we hope to achieve with all of this new effort from the moonshot. In addition, eligibility criteria here are minimal. You just have to be over age 12 now, not the traditional 18. The other point is the follow-up and all of the rigmarole of doing a clinical trial, far simplified. You do regular surveillance at whatever regular interval you would assess your patients. So it's a much more real-world experience with these drugs. Next slide. Anyway, with that, I'll just summarize what we hope to achieve with the commission added on to the good work of the Blue Ribbon Panel and of course, the congressional budgeting, and that is that through public coordination and collaboration, we want to find the best-in-class collaborators for every area. We want to reduce barriers to progress, specifically in terms of delivering care with what we know and accelerating research of many types. We want to operate more efficiently, and that means sharing data and eliminating redundancy and more quickly calling blind alleys what they are and going in another direction. Finally, deliver to the world and to the American people faster progress more efficiently so that we can measure some of the gains that we have set out for ourselves within the next 5 years. With that, I again want to thank all of you, and I want to thank our leaders, again, Liz and Chi, as well as all of the participants in these efforts beginning just a year and a half to 2 years ago. That's all this has been. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Cliff. I'd like to thank all of our speakers this morning for some wonderful presentations. We're going to have a little bit of a Q&A session now. We've got a few minutes to spare. I'll just check with our organisers here. Do we have microphones for the room, or should people go to the mic at the back? Okay. So I'm actually going to just ask one specific person in the audience to talk first, just to set get the ball rolling. As Jeff Peppercorn mentioned, all of these activities can't be done in isolation. This is a global problem. NCD, the advance and the march of the NCD epidemic is a global problem. And in the room, I have, increasing the European quotient in the room by about 100% with myself, I have Peter Naridi, who's a professor from Stockholm. And Peter is the president of the Peak European Society for Cancer Research, ECHO. And Peter's going to give a few reflections about the EU and actually how the EU Commission really should be doing the same.
I wish they would.
Yes.
So first, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, listening to these excellent presentations, which I think fit very well into what I would say a global perspective on how we look at cancer. And this is just what the Commission is. Of course, it's directed to the US, but I see this as global, and the problems and the opportunities are just as much our European ones. So I think we should take this very much on board and look what has been accomplished here in the US. I do, of course, wish that we would get the funding that you are getting. Our 28 EU member states, the cost for healthcare is about half of what it is in the US, and the funding is probably about the same, half of what you have. So I wish we can take this and go to our commission and strengthen the funding for healthcare and for research. So a few reflections that I've had during the trip. I'm really pleased to be a co-author of this paper and also now reading it. Saying that this is global, the problems are universe. First, I think that compared to the Blue Ribbon Band, this commission has strengthened the view that that imaging and treatment is much broader than only looking at basic science moving into pharmacology. So I think this is a key thing. And if the question is how do we 10 years of progress in 5 years, that's where you can gain a lot of things, because education and quality assurance speeds up the rates of cure and improved quality of life much faster than what a new basic science finding does. But saying that, what I like here is how basic science is implemented. So speeding up the process of new findings into the clinic, that's key here. So the team working that has been talked about here, it's absolutely essential. And then finally, my reflection on this commission is actually patient-centered. It's much more patient-centered than much of what we read about. Here we bring in value, and value is very difficult. What is value-based? And if we don't have the patients in the center of that discussion, and they decide what value is, we really don't reach anywhere. Because we live in different cultures, different countries. In Europe, value is different if you live in Northwestern Europe or Southeastern Europe. And I think this is key in this commission, that value is brought into the paper and really worth reading and thinking about when we then start prioritizing our resources. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Peter. So I'm now opening up the speakers to questions from the floor. If you could say your name and where you come from when you get up to ask a question, please.
Thank you. I'm Peggy Eastman from Oncology Times, and I'm wondering if you all are optimistic about, considering the changes that have been made in the administration and the current Congress, about continued level that you spoke about for cancer research and progress, because without that, without Congress, obviously, and without the support of the president, you're not going to be able to compress 10 years of cancer research into 5.
I'll just take a stab at this. We've been working. Maybe. Okay. We've been working for years to confront this. Going back about 5 years ago, many of the national organizations would talk about the problem of funding at their meetings and lament the fall off in purchasing power. Remember in the US that the Congress makes the budget. And indeed, in last spring, the White House's first skinny budget proposal cut, I think it was $6 billion from the NIH, if I'm not mistaken. But the budget that was passed actually increased funding by 2. And we've heard already that the next year's budget will have the same additional 2. So I think at the moment, as I was trying to say, the public opinion and the Congress is pretty well aligned around the need to recover some of the lost purchasing power last few years. One can never know how long it will go on, obviously, but I'll just speak personally. I'm more optimistic about at least maintaining this right now than I was 3 years ago. One other minor point. The progress of the Moonshot is not solely dependent on NIH or NCI funding, of course. There's an expectation that we will use our other resources more efficiently to make progress, and I think that's always a good charge to us and a reason, again, for optimism.
Thank you. A question? Yes, please. You've got the microphone.
My name is Joy Lee. I'm from the Senate Help Committee. I really appreciate these measures and metrics that you've laid out, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on the future plans for following up on those. Is the commission going to reconvene to measure this? Is there going to be a separate commission? Just details on how the follow-up will be taken care of.
Yes, so perhaps I can just quickly mention this. So with all of the Lancet Commission programs, we tend to follow up on these within about a 2-year window, and we follow up, look at what achievements have been made against those measures and metrics, what have we achieved so far, what is still to be done, what gaps are there, what new challenges have arisen in that period of time. So there will be a follow-up to this commission to track those measures.
Yeah. I also want to make a quick comment, because in Liz's capacity as the chair of the NCAB and currently with me at the chair of BSA, I think in the US, the NCI really is at the midst of orchestrating all the activities at the moment, and we will be tracking progress as well, and then following up with all the metrics. So that will happen.
Great. Yes.
Hi, I'm Judy Keene with the American Society for Radiation Oncology. I really commend the panel and the commission for this hard work. It's really great to see all the advances that we've had. I was wondering if you could comment. We talked a lot about the new immunotherapy and the new therapies that are out there, but the push towards doing combination therapies with what is existing and more traditional things that we had, like radiation. So when you can comment on that.
Hit the button.
Maybe. On. I didn't see a light, but then again, I'm losing my eyesight as everything else. It's a really interesting question because I'm sure you're familiar with, and I can never pronounce it correctly, the interaction between radiation, for instance, and immune checkpoint inhibitors. Abscopal effect, yeah. And as I can see, the Astro and a lot of, the NRG things are all over this, from what I understand. So there's a number of studies testing that interaction clinically with some provocative effects on T-cell exhaustion and other things. So I was very impressed to see that, because there's several people at our place that are leading some of these studies, so and know a little bit about them. So I think that at least in terms of the interaction of immune checkpoint inhibitors and radiation of all types, brachytherapy and others, I think is going to be, it looks like a very fruitful area. The early results, I understand, are positive enough to take them to phase 3s and so on. So it's seems to me from that it's moving pretty quickly.
So I'll just add, advanced cancer, whether it's locally advanced or metastatic, has never been cured with one modality. I think we all know that. And so it was part of the Blue Ribbon Panel recommendations that we study combinations and also understand why patients are sensitive versus resistant. And that was expanded on in the Lancet Commission. On top of that, I think that there's already, as you probably are aware, lots of activity at the level of drug company interactions with government and academia, looking at these combinations, and the newer forms of radiation, I think, are a major part of that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. I'm a radiobiologist by training, so just to give you some idea, the radiobiology behind the combination is very sound. Radiation is a pan-cytotoxic. It's going to cause massive local damage, increased antigen presentation in the tumor, in the microenvironment, which is perfect for coming in with immunotherapy, which then gives you a systemic effect too, rather than just localized.
Yeah, and there's one study, for some reason I have a note about it here, NRG study that's shown that the combination can reverse T-cell exhaustion. So could go beyond the abscopal and other effects. I think is very exciting.
So I just want to reflect on this very briefly on the comment that was made at the end was unnecessary competition. Right now there are more than 800 trials now registered to do combination with these checkpoints, and some of them are maybe head-to-head, if you will, competition. So how we eliminate some of this so that the field can advance is really a challenge.
Thank you. Other questions? So I have a quick question for speakers. We've seen today a lot of recommendations, which I think within the sort of institutions that we work, high-income institutions, really. We've got the means, as Cliff said, to achieve 10 years of progress in 5 years. We can achieve this. I think the challenge here in the US, of course, is that 70% or so of oncology is practiced in the community. How do we engage community hospitals and the community system?
So I ended quickly with an example of one approach, which is a simplified, streamlined, lightweight protocol that can be opened and is opened at hundreds of sites, mostly community sites, to fill a gap. And that's just one example. I think the other part of it, we're getting into a slightly different topic, but there is a continued evolution in the nature of care in the US, and it is absolutely true that most care is in the community, but increasingly many of those community sites have affiliations of various types with academic centers, and this community academic partnership actually is specifically called out in the Commission report as a way of distributing or we like to say democratizing knowledge. There are a couple of other points that I'll make. One is the conversion to electronic record keeping has been nearly universal at this point in the U.S. There are a few practices, smaller, older practices probably that aren't online yet, but virtually all of the others are. And this is potentially a two-way, not one-way street. Yes, all the data comes in, but what we can envision for the future is that while we're amassing all of this big data, which a few of us touched on, that we'll start to learn something from it, make observations, and in an ideal world, distribute knowledge back. Since I'm talking too much, I'll finish it with my favorite parable in this regard. It drives me nuts that vaccination for children, the 3-month MMR, is expected to work no matter who gives you the shot. And you choose your pediatrician by convenience, timeliness, attitude, whatever it is, but fundamentally the technical intervention, the immunization is expected to work. But as you leave here today, you will see advertisements for any number of cancer centers advertising differential outcomes for incurable and sometimes curable diseases. At some level, I would hope it really aggravates everybody that we seemingly tolerate that. Not only tolerate it, we advertise on it. If there is a way to cure early-stage non-small cell lung cancer, then our moral and ethical imperative is to make sure that everybody who can be cured is given that opportunity. On what basis do we tolerate differential effects? So this democratization of information is, I think, an underlying goal of all this. So I've given you a very long-winded plug for CancerLink, which is the ASCO loss leader in this domain, but there are other programs out there like this, and the aspiration is great. The ability to deliver, I think, is going to remain a bit of a challenge, but I think we know where we have to end up.
So David, another action that has been taken by the National Cancer Institute is through its network of over 60 cancer centers as supported by NCI. The new stipulation right now is that you have to have a component to describe community outreach and engagement, where, as my previous job as Cancer Center Director at Penn, we actually reach into the community hospital as part of the health system to implement what we find in the research arena out into the community. So this has happened at many places at Johns Hopkins and other places as well. So.
Yeah, just the issue of the competition among centers and within centers among individuals is a major challenge because the way people are evaluated for promotion and rankings and all sorts of stuff tend to promote that. But I think we, as Cliff mentioned, somehow we have to get around that. And when I end up dealing with these kinds of conflicts, I get people in my start off and say, come on, guys, the enemy is cancer. That sometimes works. But I think that you sort of lose sight of that. And then again, these opportunities of with TAPR and other regimens, working with NCI is important. There's immunotherapy, very promising immunotherapy combination that's been attached to the NCI match trial for rare tumors. So I think that where appropriate, those are really good venues to work together.
Absolutely. We've got a question here from Lindsay Fraser, who coincidentally is the co-lead on an upcoming Lancet Oncology Commission looking at the burden of childhood cancer and how we can overcome that. That's next
thank you
year.
very much, David.
But,
and I'm here with my colleagues who helped write the pediatric chapter, but for this commission, Sumit Gupta and Ruth Hoffman. But I'm interested in your comments about this issue of where care happens in the United States, which is particularly poignant for adolescents and young adults who mostly receive their care in community settings by, quite honestly, oncologists that don't know much about the diseases that they face, because they're really rare diseases in adult oncology, sarcoma, germ cell tumors, lymphomas. So I'm just wondering if there's any comment from the panel about what you see as a future focus in the United States on this particularly vulnerable population, both in terms of access to care, but also from Jeff's perspective, the interruption on the trajectory of their lives and the unique survivorship issues that they face.
absolutely, please.
Well, I'll address that. So I think you're absolutely correct. In fact, at the Blue Ribbon panel discussions, that population in particular, pediatric cancers and that population in particular, were focused on as major areas. And again, for those of you who don't know, often we take drugs from adults and then try it in pediatrics, and that's the wrong approach because pediatric cancers typically are due to fusion proteins, not due to these mutations we talked about. So there's a lot of emphasis on that, and then we did expand that to make sure that these are areas that are covered. I think and again, the survivorship, I think they're really the key in survivorship. We have to be starting there. Chi had mentioned that. I mean, these are children who hopefully now are being cured. They're our future. We need to make sure that they have good quality of lives. And then access, they're part of the access. That came up as well. Kids, we forget about the kids, but there are a lot of poor children out there who don't have access. So you're absolutely correct. This has to be at the front of where we think about things.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, I'm going to wrap up this little bit of a Q&A, and I'm going to invite Dr. Rothman, who's the Dean of the Medical Faculty and CEO of Johns Hopkins, for some concluding remarks.
Thank you, David. Can I first just, everyone join me in giving our speakers today a big round of applause for... It really was a superb discussion. I learned a lot and really admire you for the work you've done. I have a couple people to thank first. First of all, Senator Ben Cardin and his staff who sponsored us in this space today. So thank you, Senator Cardin. I'd like to thank the Lancet Oncology, David, for your group for sponsoring the commission and for all the work that you and your staff have done. Doug Lawyer, who left. I'd like to thank Ed and the Ludwig Cancer Research Institute and Chi for helping, and the Wistar Institute for helping to sponsor today. I'm going to give a little bit different perspective. I think I'm the only person here who doesn't treat cancer, and so I'm a rheumatologist by training. But I really thought a lot about what I heard today. And again, I first want to thank you and applaud you for the thoughtful approach you took to taking the moonshot findings and translating that into, I like the paradigm for a strategic plan. It's sort of much more metric driven, really drove it down to something that I think is measurable. And so I applaud you for that and the thoughtfulness that went with that. And then I sat here today and Liz, when you talked about saying a dideoxy sequencing, I did my first experiment in cancer research that same year. So I have a 40-year perspective on this. I am not an oncologist, but I've been involved here. And I was thinking about why cancer is different and why, in fact, cancer today, as we talk about it on the Hill and to the American public, is just different. And I have two reasons, one of which is cancer is a very personal disease. I think if I asked for a raise of hands here for everyone's been touched by this disease, I think it would be uniform, that we all know someone that has been affected. And I think about, again, the longitudinal view of American, or actually world healthcare. And if you think about it, for a century or so, we really took on what I would consider low-hanging fruit, which is really infectious diseases, and that's because of the basic scientists, the organisms that infect us that are not us are actually fairly easy to understand because they're different and fairly easy to treat because they have very different mechanisms for everything they do from metabolism to cell division. And so we've been able to target those, and because they're different, our ability to harness the immune system to fight them with vaccines has really doubled our lifespan over a little over a century. So in fact, the harder diseases to tackle are the ones that really are us. And I think about where we were when I began 40 years ago, where we really still didn't know what caused cancer. We just found our first oncogenes, and the question is, were they the exception or the rule? Think about all that basic work that went on to get to where we are today, where Liz described, from real understanding of mechanisms. And then all the immunology. I'm an immunologist. All the immunology that went into understanding, checkpoints and where we are today in immunotherapy and others. And I can't help but marvel at the progress we've made. And for me, looking at this and seeing how we now, an HPV treatment, I mean, we're going to cure a cancer. I mean, that was unthinkable 40 years ago. I mean, we didn't even understand why it occurred, what was the etiology. And I think now we're going to fundamentally, if we disseminate it, cure, a cervical, it's really an amazing journey. And again, we've been around a couple 100,000 years, and over 40 years to have all this research go into and to really think about cures of cancer. Cancer, the most dreaded of human diseases, is for me, again, I'm sitting here, I'm not an oncologist, but just as someone who helps run a medical center, is really remarkable. And so I want to applaud the people up here for the hard work to do that. It is, it is exhausting, but I've never seen excitement around our ability to cure disease and to have long-term, and we talk about survivorship. I mean, it's a big issue, and access to all the things that we're now discovering. I mean, again, when you take a step back and look at that journey over 40 years or 50 years, I mean, 1971 was Nixon's war. I mean, it's not so long ago, and it's really remarkable. So I really think that's why it's such a good time to think about the moonshot, to think about then taking that moonshot and driving it down to measurables that we're going to be held accountable for, and to think about it not just in the treatments and cures, but the early diagnosis and prevention to survivorship and access. It's really, for me, a really remarkable story. I applaud all of you for your hard work in getting us to where we are. And I want to thank everyone, and we have some people on the Hill here. I want to thank Congress for their support of medical research and cancer research. There's often hyperbole around medical research. I don't want to say that too loud, but I think in terms of what we're doing in cancer, it's not hyperbole. We have made and will continue to make changes in this disease that we could have only imagined 40 years ago. So I want to thank everyone for coming and spending this morning with us. I hope you appreciated what you heard as much as I did. So thank you and have a great day.